arbitration departments are always going to be a part of the auction.
I probably would have lit all the arbitration people on fire.
So as a dealer, it's really critical that you have some kind of relationship with somebody there who can make sure things are happening.
Like you said, it doesn't matter if I lose. I just want to feel like someone's in my camp. But the auctions feel they can get away with this because they're saying, well, this is what we can buy it for. Well, I would challenge that.
Transparency is something we will not be able to get away from in the industry.
Like, you have to learn how to communicate of what you can help with rather than what you can't do. Because if
here's who we are, we're human beings, we're trying to do our job. An arbitrator needs to have more skill.
Training can't be an expense anymore. It has to be an investment, because are we looking for excuses, or are we mapping out how to be effective?
People are having to shift the way they do business. The auction's going to have to change with it. And that rule number one that we always look to, which is fair and ethical. So fair and ethical means...
Are you wasting your time and money on inefficiencies in the business? Are sales down and lead conversion rates are low? Are you having problems building or maintaining inventory levels? What does it really take to win in the automotive industry?
Get the cars that make sense for your store rather than just wishing at an auction. So it gives you that better control.
With over 25 years of experience, Darrell the Wolf Steed isn't just another industry voice. He's the guy who's out there solving real problems for dealers just like you.
They'll even say in the Pacific Northwest, where you're at, that it's a tougher market. It's, it's tougher to find cars. The market's a little bit softer. And in the midst of all this, your turn doubled and your profit's up 75%.
Yes.
The truth hurts only when it should. Are you ready to hear the truths? Darrell is here to unpack the hard truths and the proven strategies that will take your dealership from struggling to soaring. And he is taking it all in the streets, with real talk, open dialogue, unfiltered conversations. This is the podcast series, Street Smarts, powered by SmartWolf Consulting.
Welcome to another edition of Street Smarts, powered by SmartWolf Consulting. Today we have ourselves a real special guest, somebody who's been in the auto industry and had to navigate some of the toughest climates that you could possibly put yourself in. From the auction standpoint to my favorite thing in the whole wide world called arbitration. It's some of my favorite people. I mean, if they were disinvented, I would be a happy person. And then she's moved over to one of the most notable transportation companies, providing a great service and really creating that dynamic of engagement with her dealer partners, right? A real partnership of how do they win together. So I'm pretty excited to see, one, what they offer, but two, to kind of get some interesting takes on what's happening in the market, what she's seeing. So by no further ado, let's welcome Marissa to the podcast. Marissa, thank you so much for jumping on with us and giving me the opportunity to look like a fool and talk to you for a little while.
You're very welcome.
As we start every podcast, we like to ask every guest, where are you winning in life? I don't want to hear about what you're doing in your career, because I'm sure that's great, but where are you winning in life? What's going well for you?
This is relevant because we're talking like the week after Thanksgiving, but I absolutely nailed the pies this year. I love cooking. It's one of my favorite things. And I've been on a mission to make like the perfect pie crust, and I hit it. I'm like, I've peaked now, I don't know where I go from here, but this was it, man. Pie crust.
So I think that's fantastic. One, because pie is the best dessert. Okay, cake is not worth the conversation. And
cake is the only thing that's even close to pie. And I did make a chocolate peanut butter cheesecake, which was excellent.
Oh, I mean, cheesecake, I guess that's like cheating, but like pie, peach pie, and everything but blueberry pie. Blueberry pie is a little weird for me, but everything else is great. So that's fantastic. And hey, I love the fact it's something simple, right? It's not complicated. You're just enjoying life and, trying to nail something down that people for hundreds of years haven't been able to figure it out. It's the perfect pie crust. She's done it, guys. The race is over. It's over. So, Marissa, tell us a little bit about yourself and tell us kind of your journey in the auto industry, because in all fairness, you have had not like a crazy one, but you've taken some unique pathways through the industry and had success in a lot of these different areas. So it'd be great to hear kind of where you started and where you're at now.
Yeah, I'm happy to share. I actually started in the auto industry out of spite. which I think is the motivator for most of the things that I do in my life, except making pie crust. But I was driving. At the time I was a high school dropout, a college dropout, a single mom, and my job had been working for my daughter's dad. So I no longer had a job. And I was driving by a CarMax, and they had we're hiring sign. I knew nothing about cars at all. And I mentioned to, my daughter's father that I was going to apply. And he's like, you can't do that job. Not only can you don't know anything about cars, and you can't sell. And I immediately went, okay, I'm going to get that job. I did get the job. I progressed my career with CarMax. I became a sales mentor and then a buyer. And then I was a used car buyer for a time for them. And I also managed their wholesale auction out here in California in Buena Park. From there, I went to Manheim. I did dealer services and transportation at Manheim SoCal. Moved from there to Ready Logistics, which is everybody's favorite transportation company. And then went from Ready Logistics to probably my favorite role as far as what I learned, and that was regional arbitration director for the West. About 2 weeks after I took that role, the entire world went into lockdown. And so we were transitioning our arbitration team from being local auction arbitration focused to a more regional arbitration team. And that happened right at the right time because literally I started February 28th and by March 15th, we were on lockdown in California.
Well, there's worse place to be locked down. I find that interesting that you said your favorite job was arbitration. So we can already tell that this podcast is going to come right off the rails and be unhinged. All right, keep going.
Yeah. So, with arbitration, as you mentioned, it's one of my favorite jobs. Part of the reason is because I feel like arbitration is, it's like a big puzzle, really. And it's tense. I'm not going to lie. There's a lot of conflict. There's a lot of, some people have said things that were really, really horrible to arbitrators. And there's definitely the negatives. I can't say that arbitration is going to be an easy job for anyone. But what I found is that really the key pieces of being successful in arbitration is, critical thinking, negotiation, and most important is relationship building. There's a lot that you can do if people trust that what you're doing is looking for a win-win. And you can't really get that kind of trust unless they know who you are and they have a relationship with you. So those were some key things that I really enjoyed about working in arbitration that I felt made me effective. And I actually took that. And then after I left Manheim, as I like to say, I kept getting called back in and saying, the auction's telling me this. Is this true? Is this how the policy works? Can you clarify? And eventually I just started charging for that advice. And so now I have my arbitration business.
She loves it so much that she did it herself, which is interesting. Yes. Now, I think it's great that you have your own business, that you do that, mostly because when you think about arbitration, and as dealers watch this, I would be surprised if they won't relate to this immediately. When you work for, let's just say, Cox, being that they have a large arbitration department, being that they own the largest auction in the world,
yeah,
it makes it very difficult to have any trust, even if I like the person, because if the arbitration's done by Cox and I bought the vehicle from Manheim, they're I get it. Separate departments, but birds of a feather. So they have the wherewithal to understand they're still working on behalf of the auction of maximizing and minimizing loss. So you being on your own, I think, is kind of this unique perspective of, because you have no tie-ins to anyone. It is truly the third party arbitration of, this is my professional opinion. This is what you should be able to do. This is how I can help guide you, rather than this is what you're allowed to do. Because you're not under these scopes, you're giving advice of how to handle it or how to engage it, rather than, sorry, my hands are tied, this is all I can do for you. So,
and something that you mentioned there that I think is going to be important to bring up is arbitration departments are always, right now, as arbitration stands, will this be this way forever? We don't know. But for right now, arbitration departments are always going to be a part of the auction, because arbitration is one of the key roles of an auction. They do three things. They do marketplace, they do payments/titles, making sure all that's clear, and then they do dispute resolution. That's pretty much the key thing auctions are doing. So they're going to have their arbitration departments. Yeah. And I think it's important for dealers to realize that doesn't necessarily mean that they're never going to be successful at arbitrating because these arbitrators are only going to be defending the auction's bottom line. What it means is that because the arbitration team is part of the auction, it's important for the dealer to have a relationship with that auction so that they can understand, what are the priorities of this auction? Are they really focused on making sure that these cars are getting announced correctly? And so now you're a seller and you're incorrectly announcing and you're feeling that heat? Or is it an auction where they're maybe a little bit more buyer friendly? So now as a seller, I need to be aware of that. And I need to make sure that I'm, protecting my buyers. Like, these are things that don't necessarily mean that arbitration is going to be a failing venture for any dealer. It just is something that they need to include in their process when they're building their arbitration teams, when they're planning their arbitration strategies. Assume that the auction is going to be protecting themselves. So your job is not necessarily to, just rant and rail and go, the auction, they're never going to help me. Say, here is how it is in your best interest, auction, to help me with this situation. And that's really just the long and short of it.
Yeah, no, and it's funny you say that I find interesting, right? Is it really is understanding that relationship, right? Your auctioneer, who you deal with in titles and arbitration, but oddly enough, that's never the person you see when you set up the accounts. But more importantly, is when I've had issues with arbitration, and I've had one good one where it was it was a dream every time. I was waiting for when's it going to stop? And most of the time it's been, it's also part of, I think, the training, the developing of the arbitration team or whoever's training them is there needs to be a communication of how I can help, not what I can't do. Right. Yes. There's no pivot point to, I understand just like anybody else, does not mean I like it when you tell me there's things that can't be done because you have rules and parameters and everything else. I understand.
Right.
But you have to learn how to communicate of what you can help with rather than what you can't do. Because if all I'm ever telling you what I can't do, you're a real problem for me because you're just creating roadblocks. But I think that's something the auction can learn. And if they're listening, okay, all you auction people out there, especially with what we're paying for cars in today's market, is that person, whoever's the arbitration person or whoever is entitled to resolving disputes, that person needs to be involved in the setup with accounts, and at least once a quarter should be meeting, seeing, doing something so that there's a face to a name, there's a person, right? It's a lot harder to, let's say, get angry and yell at someone that I have a relationship with than someone that's on a BDC phone call in a different country telling me they can't do something. I'm like, listen, I just want to reach through the phone and choke you to death. So
that's something that we did do is we did have some of the arbitrators when they had these, major accounts, people that either on a buyer or seller side, we introduced them. We said, hey, let's have it either if they're too far away, we'll do a virtual call. If we're close by, we'll do in person. Let's just pay a visit, say hello. Here's who we are. We're human beings. We're trying to do our job. And the job is pretty tough. So, let's work together. Let's try to find win-wins as much as we possibly can.
Well, and I think that's like you said, if I meet you, right, and you understand terminology and then engagement is hey, my job is to find the best win-win possible in every situation. That does not always mean that you're going to win, and it doesn't always mean I'm going to win. I'm just trying to find the best middle ground. And then they like you, right? Because I think that's the other part of it. If I meet you and I absolutely can't stand you, right, for whatever particular reason, it's just a personality flaw between me and you. It's then you can say hey, I'd like to get somebody else. Why? Because you're just going to create a dynamic that's going to be a problem. And funny enough, not that I do much business with Cox Automotive, with Mannheim, just because I actually like profit for my stores that I help. And I don't like paying it in fees, but they brought in a rep. She's very sweet. Her name's Elisa or Elisa, however you say it. And she's my job is to basically navigate the arbitration and the buying and these type of things. And what was interesting about that is she's very likable. It would be very difficult to be mad with her. She's very likable. She's very sweet. And I was see, they figured it out. Okay. They brought someone in here that would be damn near impossible to be mad at. But when something goes wrong, I give her a call, and then it's she takes care of it, which that's the other side of it. Do you have the competent people to ensure it gets done? Because if you're going to say you're going to get it done, it needs to get done. It can't be one of those things where you're oh yeah, I'm going to get it done, and then it's another person you've put in the mix that doesn't do it.
Yeah.
Now, when it comes to used cars, because obviously with you having your own company to where you can advise and counsel people and when they deal with these things and, and help stores and groups, you live in the used car world. I mean, that's where you're at. Like, what have you seen from the time, obviously, when you started at CarMax, and you started at it when, like, before they were the behemoths, right? Like, I mean, now they're just a force that can't be stopped.
Can't, yeah.
And then you go into arbitration. What have you seen in the market that's really changed, and how is the auto industry like done well and missed on some of these changes in the industry?
That's a really good question. I was actually talking to a couple auction leaders about that today. Is essentially, what lessons can we learn from the last 5-ish years about where arbitration is going in the future? And I think there's a couple of key things, and one of them is transparency. Transparency is something we will not be able to get away from in the industry, for whether you're a dealer, you're an auction, wherever you are. Our buyers, retail buyers, and professional, car buyers, they're expecting more transparency. They're expecting to know what's going on with the car before they buy it. And if there's something wrong, they have a full expectation that this is going to be addressed. And where in the past, I know is, when we initially start with arbitration, I remember, dealers were walking into the our office and a mechanic would come out and walk with them to the car. That's not something that's going to happen anymore, right? The people are no longer in person, which means that these inspections that we're doing are so much more important. They're absolutely critical to our buyers' trust and our sellers' trust. And then the other piece is that because there's that distance, as a buyer or a seller, if I were in their position, I would really invest some time in making sure that I knew the human beings behind the phone calls at the auction, so that if I needed, as you pointed out, with Elisa. Is it Elisa Rister, by the way?
It is. It is Elisa.
Yeah, I know her.
Yeah,
she's
Elisa
awesome.
Rister.
She and I work together at Mannheim SoCal. And she's great. But the people like her are the people who are going to make things happen. And so as a dealer, it's really critical that you have some kind of relationship with somebody there who can make sure things are happening. But a lot of the arbitration is going for, like, we even have third parties at different Mannheim locations. They have third-party mobile mechanics who go and do the inspections at your lot, essentially. And so that's what we're seeing is same with every other part of the industry, where they're expecting essentially more convenience and more transparency. That is also happening in the auction industry, and we're seeing it with arbitration as well.
So it's funny you use that word just at the end, right, of convenience. Yes. And this is going to be the only time you hear me actually say on my podcast that we might want to give the auction a little grace. I've said it, and now I'll never say it again because I don't actually believe this because they make too much money. But I think that when we talk about grace, there is a convenience to it. Now, when I say that, there's a convenience to, if they do the inspection, a thorough inspection, not one when it gets to my store, I find more stuff. Right. And they get it to your store and everything else. I think there is a fee for convenience, like anything else. You want me to deliver the car to your doorstep? It's going to cost money. If you want me to pick up a car because I've bought it, it's going to, I might not give you as much money, but you're getting convenience. Convenience costs something. And I agree. It's the level of professionalism and what you get for that convenience that I think is the disconnect of, if I'm paying, I'll just throw out a number, $400 for a post-sale inspection fee, which, depending on the car, is that too much? I don't know, right? Like, that's a weird conversation, because what do you get for that, and how confident can you be in that inspection? If I never have any problems once they do it, man, I don't know, that might be the right money. But if it's like I do that and then it gets to my store and there's more issues, then it's like, what am I paying for, right? Is this a money grab, or is this an actual value? So I think when we talk about convenience and transparency, is not only do we have to be transparent to what we're doing, but then we need to be explaining all the things that even aren't covered under, let's call the drivetrain. Like, it had this, this, and this. It doesn't matter if it unwinds the car. I need to know exactly what I'm getting into. And then whatever you're charging for services, they need to be, it's almost like that under promise, over deliver. It needs to be more than I expect, not less. And I don't know if that conversation's ever been had, like on a dealer cancel or anything of that nature of, hey, what would be an effective rate, or what effective this to, where if I didn't jam up arbitration, right? Like, I think Mannheim gets a lot of bad rap, but it's self-induced of, if I pay $700 as a lane fee, and then $300 for an inspection, I haven't gotten to transport, and then I have ARB, I'm like, I paid $1,000, and now the arbitration department is going through their song, and it's like, I feel like you're getting nickeled and dimed, rather than, did you deliver more than expectations, and was it communicated properly, right? So I do think convenience is something that we have to understand. We have to pay for. Convenience is not free.
And the way that, auctions are viewing is arbitration is really always going to be a cost center. It's not necessarily ever going to generate revenue, right? Like pretty much every auction needs to have some kind of arbitration department, because it's one of the core functions of an auction is making sure that the sale is clean. But ultimately that they have a whole department that their only job is going to be essentially giving away money, right? Like they're going to be negotiating, trying to keep as much as they can. But if they're being successful, there are going to be times that they're going to be handing out the auctions money. So I think training of the ARB team is going to be absolutely critical, because really arbitration isn't quite the same job as somebody who's maybe a dealer sales coordinator who's setting the lanes and making sure cars are represented correctly. An arbitrator needs to have more skill, not necessarily like the dealer sales coordinators are not skilled. It's just that they need additional and different skills. And not only do they need to be able to talk to people, they need to have enough understanding of how a vehicle works so they can speak intelligently about what's going on with it. So if something's wrong, the arbitrator needs to be able to explain that and be able to have a back and forth conversation, because the next piece after critical thinking that's going to be really important for an arbitrator is negotiating. In negotiating, you have to know what you want. If you don't know what you want, you're on the back foot. Essentially, you're not going to be as successful in your negotiations. So the critical thinking and negotiation pieces for an arbitrator are absolutely critical. They need to be able to review the car, understand what's happening, and then they need to be able to figure out what is going to be a resolution that minimizes loss for the auction, maybe, but definitely honors the fair and ethical sale that we're all being held to, and allows for a real trust in this process.
So with that being said, I have a couple questions, because that's your realm of expertise. And at this point, I'm going to take the advantage of learning right now, because you have more skill set in that area. I only deal with the other side of it.
Yeah.
When we talk about, okay, they need to be better. They need to be the one that has more skill set, which I 100% agree with, because you're dealing with every side of every facet. I mean, it's coming at you all the time.
Yeah.
In your professional opinion, what do you think the reality of that actually being, that they get better in that realm? Only reason I ask that is in almost every industry or every piece of the automotive industry, training is the last thing that we actually account for as valuable. And it's more of an every single element. Baptism by fire seems to be the training method, which worked, call it 50 years ago. I don't know if it necessarily is effective now. I mean, I know it isn't. But do we really believe that that's going to be something we can hope for, or that can happen when most companies don't look at training as an investment? They look at it as a cost.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that that's a really good point. And baptism by fire is definitely how, I was introduced to arbitration, when I was wholesale manager at CarMax. And CarMax is very famous for having really good systems and having really good standard operating procedures, and their teams are really well trained. That even so, in the arbitration process, when I was being trained on how to manage arbitration for CarMax, my leaders, the different people training me, they would have different perspectives on how things needed to go, and whether or not this person or this issue was something that was major enough to be an issue, or this other person says that's not a major issue, that's a minor issue, you can fix it very easily. So really, from the beginning, I was very passionate about trying to align our training so that we're at least getting the same training. I actually put together a mechanical training for buyers for CarMax for the Southern California and Vegas region, where people, came in, and we did a full day of, training on mechanics and how does that impact arbitration. So the fact that dealers don't, generally in the industry, that we don't want to invest in training is something that I really feel like we're just going to have to get over it. Like, really, as you pointed out, baptism by fire has never worked. It worked well enough. Yeah. But I think you actually had another guest on the podcast who was talking about, what about all those people that couldn't quite get there, that maybe the fire was a bit too hot? It doesn't necessarily mean that they didn't have something to add to the industry. It was just perhaps that wasn't the right time for them, or perhaps this wasn't the right spot. Sure. And we're burning out a lot of these potentially great talent just by not properly introducing them to what they're supposed to be doing here. And I think the auctions are definitely taking some notes. I can't, I'm not, I'm not in at the auction, so I can't say that they're going to be investing a ton of money into training. But that's actually something that I want to do in, the next iteration of this business is raise the level of professionalism of arbitrators at auctions. Because there are professional arbitration organizations, but they're for lawyers. They're for people who are doing, arbitration for much more complex or different processes. In wholesale auction arbitration, there really isn't a arbitrator like professional organization that's going to make sure that they have, hit these certain benchmarks and that they know enough to be able to be successful. And so that's what I'm working on, building is essentially how do we make it not only, effective, we want to have an effective training, but we also want to have one that can fit in with the already busy time that every auction has. Auctions generally are not famous for overstaffing, right? Like we tend to have issues where we have not enough people to do the work that goes around. And so training, as you noted, it goes to the back burner. So the challenge for people like me and like you who are out here trying to raise the level of professionalism in the industry is finding a way to fit the training into a process that works for them. And it, obviously we want them to change. We want them to do different. We want them to invest more in this. But until they start to see more results and that flywheel keeps going with their, they're looking across the street and seeing that guy having better success. And what's the secret? Oh, he got, Darrell over here to teach him how to do a buy center. Like, until we start seeing that and we keep pushing in that direction, it's really the thing we're going to have to do is as individuals, as dealers, as buyers and sellers of cars, we need to be as professional and as educated as we can be. And that's really a lot of times when I'm working, the arbitrators that I work with, I've never worked with an arbitrator who I felt was just trying to screw people over. Right. And I know that I speak with customers all the time. So I know that that's the perception. These arbitrators are just trying to screw me over. Most of the time, the reason that there isn't a good claim resolution is, well, of course, the obvious one, which is it's not a valid claim. Like we're all upset. I get it. Fair and ethical doesn't mean no one loses money. Fair and ethical means that these rules were followed. Right. And so aside from those complaints, like we're still seeing a lot of situations where an arbitrator isn't fully explaining what's happening or an arbitrator isn't responding. That's actually the most frustrating thing that I think a lot of my clients deal with is I just can't get a hold of anybody. And that's part of the value that I bring is that I do know people that I can call to get a hold of people. And it feels silly that that's something that I can, that I offer as a business is essentially, I know who to call. But shouldn't we all be able to just call the auction and get the answers that we need? Right. Until...
Yeah, in theory.
Right. But as we're working toward building, I guess, a more professional foundation for these types of departments, there are going to be people like me who are going to be working through the margins and making sure that, that essentially we're respecting the rules as they're laid out.
I think though, so I have another question, but before I say that, ask that is, I think like for people like you, again, I think it comes down to two things, right? Likability and having someone like you also gives that inherent confidence to a dealer. And unfortunately, and much like anything else, let's call it 15 years, because that's about what it takes the car business to grab onto anything that's new.
Yeah.
Is if an arbitrator called me and he was on top of everything, I mean, every day following up with me, as someone I had on my podcast used the term, gave me the non-update updates, right? just kept me in the loop. I still wouldn't trust him because of just like the auto industry to the consumer, there's been too many things put out there that allows you to like have this wall up. So your business, I think, actually has more of that confidence of, I have someone that doesn't work for them, which means they're looking out for my best interest. And like you said, I don't expect you to win. I want the real, I want to make sure I'm just not getting clipped. So I think that's where the confidence of having somebody like you is like someone that knows what they're doing and they're going to war for me. You want someone working for you. I don't want to feel like someone's not working for me.
Yeah. And I think that's the value that I bring in a lot of ways. And so for some customers, I'll just do one-off claims and some of them I'll manage their whole claim, all of their claims for the cars that they're running or buying at the auction. It really just is kind of your mileage may vary, but ultimately that's really what they need. A lot of times they kind of have an idea that there's something off about a claim and they just can't quite put their finger on specifically what it is that they feel is unfair. So then when I'm talking to them and I work through the claim process and I review all of the communication from the auction, I can pretty quickly pick out like, here's the misses, or here's the things that the auctions weren't considering, or were trying to, kind of maybe gloss over, or maybe just kind of move past this. But these are the things that we're going to be able to use to share with them that we think this decision needs to be changed.
And I think the other question is, because again, it goes into this is, so I've had some conversations with arbitration before, and they'll say stuff like, and they're trying to resolve it. So they're very melancholy about it. And they're just like, hey, so we have the solution. And I still can never wrap my head around this. So I'm hoping that you can shed some light on this, because you've been on that side of it. Is they'll say it needs a transmission. Let's just say, and they're like, well, we found a used transmission for, call it $2,500. And so you guys should be able to do that for whatever, $4,000. But then you put it in your shop, and they're like, the shop's like, oh, that's a $7,000 repair. So of course I then asked the arbitrator, I'm like, hey, where are you getting this? What's going on? Well, they get you they found the cost of this, but there's no markup. Then they factored in like a $90 an hour labor rate, which I don't know anyone in America that's charging $90 an hour in service. So then it gets into this question of like, are you guys coming to fix this for me? Because no one in my store is going to fix this for me for that cost. So why is there that disparity? Because you can't advise people on what the cost of business is if you're not actually the one doing the business.
No, that's actually a really good question. That's something that I dealt with and addressed when I was director at Mannheim, because Mannheim, and during my time there, they increased their labor rate from, I think it was 85 or 95. They increased it to 115 for California. And they may have even increased it since then, because labor rate for a service has gone up significantly. But in the NAAA, it says that essentially the auction's cost is what they're going to base the decision on. So if it's, an $800 part for you, but a $500 part at wholesale, the auction is going to go off the $500 part. Their assumption is that as a professional in this industry, you will have access to parts that are going to be at a wholesale or remand cost, right? They're not necessarily going to be replacing everything with OEM. And that is a conflict that I had there, because when we're quoting it, there's no markup, right? But there's going to be a markup, as you noted. But the auction's position is essentially that if you are a dealer, you don't necessarily have to pay retail prices. And so if you choose to pay retail prices, that's your prerogative. However, many dealers, especially CPOs, they need to have the OEM parts, right? They need to be able to say that this is something that is not just a reman transmission that we pulled out of a junkyard. This is an actual, Toyota transmission. And that's something that the auction was actually wrestling with and kind of working on addressing. Is historically, we've always considered it, wholesale auction costs, that's what it's going to be. But now that we have all these really robust CPO programs and people are expecting used cars to show up as closer to their new cars, right? The auction's actually having to relook at that and say, how do we handle this? How do we make sure to address it? Because really, the way that things have been designed, as you mentioned before, it may have worked 40 years ago. Maybe that wasn't that big of a deal. But these days, things are a lot more complex. It's a lot less likely that you're going to get a good reman transmission. You're going to need one that's an OEM, just because of how complex everything is. So that's a good question. And the answer is the auction is working on that. That's actually something that we discussed when I was there, is how do we address this? What are we doing to change it? They did take a couple of actions while I was there. And again, I'm speaking about Mannheim. I know other auctions are also addressing this as well. My particular experience is with Mannheim.
I'm sure if they're doing it, then like if you're not doing it, you're not far behind. I mean, they all roughly do the same things, or they have the same. Now, I'm curious, because even if they address that, right? Like they're like, hey, we're making strides. Like you said, let's say it's 115 for labor rate for California, because we all know that California is more expensive. I mean, I laugh at that because forget about retail rates. Just think internal rates for like a pot lot or like a family on lot. Like they charge more than 115 an hour. So I have this real issue with it. Well, and when I say I have this issue, it's an industry thing. Is if I went into a store right now as a consultant and I told them, this is how you need to do it, and this is how you need to do it. I've never met a GM in their life or an owner that goes like this. So you're going to tell me how to run my business and you don't own part of my business? No. But the auctions feel they can get away with this because they're saying, well, this is what we can buy it for. Well, I would challenge that. I would challenge that on every level because, okay, so the whole cost, we'll use your analogy of 500 and 800. If it's 500, you're telling me as Mannheim, Odessa, Copart, any of these, you're going to buy it for 500 and then you're going to charge me $115 per hour to put it in, and you're going to make no profit on the expense of you putting people to work? See,
No.
they're using a number based on them not having to actually do the work.
Well, they do. They do occasionally do the work. So
I'm saying is like, so they're not going to do that without profit. You're not buying a car wholesale or a part wholesale and then not marking it up.
Right. But even if the markup, say the markup is 20%, right? Like there's going to be that markup, but generally even with the markup, it's generally going to be somewhat close. It just depends on, I guess I should say it depends on the part. Like if the $500 part, 20% is going to be a huge deal. But if we're talking about a much more expensive part, then obviously that's a big issue. But ultimately, no, they're not going to do it without charging. They're assuming that you, as a dealer, could get that part wholesale and use one of your employees to replace it, which means that you're paying a labor rate that is not a retail labor rate. And that's, I think, an assumption that's based on the way businesses ran in the past. But a lot, like, as you noted, especially mom and pops, they don't have in-house mechanics. They don't have somebody who can drop a trans, right? They need to take it to AMCO or, wherever their local guy is. And those guys are going to be charging a lot more. And that's ultimately the auction's position in the past has been, that's like your business decision. If you're choosing not to employ mechanics, then that's kind of not our problem. But as the industry changes and as people are having to shift the way they do business, the auction's going to have to change with it.
Yeah, I think it's just one of those things where if we talk fair and equitable, forget dealerships, right? Forget dealerships. I mean, I think they have to be in the conversation, but let's take the Jiffy Lubes, the Amcos, the Good Wrenches, all those things, the Big O tires. If you did just a conglomeration of all the services that are out there and just took the average hourly rate, if they're lower than that, which 115, even 130 would be lower than that, it's how are you able to do it at that scale? Like, it's one of those things. If you're going to come up with the rules, don't they have to then kind of be like on the curve of like, what does the average person then do, rather than I'm coming up with a number that I feel works for me. But if it doesn't work for 90% of the people, then it doesn't work.
Right. And I think that's where the auction's probably going to have some data that indicates it isn't necessarily 90% of the people. I think a while ago they posted about their customer breakdown, and I think something like 30% of customers were the independents. The moms and pops, the ones that are less likely to have an on-staff mechanic and a rack and all those things that you would need in order to do heavy line work. And so ultimately, it's kind of up to the auction to address with each client. But that's why the NAAA has that a little bit of gray area, a little bit of flex, and that rule one, number one that we always look to, which is fair and ethical. So fair and ethical means, as I said earlier, it doesn't mean no one loses money. It means that the sale was as it should have been, as the expectations were all met in the sale. And
maybe that's the solution to the conversation point next time that they get together is, well, the NAAA, right, is based on a global scale, or not a global scale, but a U.S. scale rather than a regional scale, right? You're talking about a national look. And so, yes, if I'm in Kansas City, Missouri, the cost of doing business is significantly less than California, New York, Hawaii. Right. So maybe that's the solution is you need to re-advise based on regional data. Yeah. Because I bet you that's where the 115 kind of comes from is if we look at regional and then do a cost of living adjustment or whatever else for them, then on average it's 80, but over here it's 40% more. So they put that on there. Well, it still doesn't get it to scale, right? Maybe that's the math that they're missing. For instance, when we do evaluations, KBB, Cars.com, Black Book, they don't sit there and say, okay, the value of the car is the same on the East Coast as the West Coast. They have regional diversification for that reason.
Right. And they do that at the auctions. Different auctions have different labor rates. It depends on where they are. And that's where Manheim, at least when they're localizing, or not localizing, when they're regionalizing their arbitration teams, they were leaving them physically at the auction so that they could stay connected with the regional needs of the area, like whatever auction is there. So, and I mean, ultimately, when it comes to labor rates, that's something that I think the auctions are going to adjust over time. I think they're going to, as you say, they're going to kind of have to meet their customers where they're at. But I think that there's a lot more going on with arbitration than a lot of times, the labor rate I've heard from others, and I'm not saying that you're not telling the truth, but I've heard from others that the labor rate is high. And it just kind of depends. I've heard, generally I would hear sellers complaining saying, no, you can pay your own mechanic to do that this much. That's ridiculous that you guys are going to charge this much. So it really, when it comes to the prices and the labor rates, those things tend to be very, very specific to claim, and they are very, very specific to region, as you noted. So I think each auction is going to have to respond in its own way. And I don't know if because ultimately it's the NAAA that says it's like auction's discretion, it's the auction's cost, but each individual auction then has its own marketplace policies, and they're able to make those adjustments as they need to.
Now, when you're dealing with obviously used market and seeing what's going on, where do right, with Nickels LLC, right? Like, where do you fall into? Who's the person that says, okay, hey, we need you? Like, how do you either find your business, or how do people reach out to you? Like, where do you fall into that? Because I'm interested in this, the fact that you're an independent, right, that does this, because I personally believe, I've talked to a couple of people too, that I love the idea of someone that's working for me, that I again, that level of trust, or just, and like you said, it doesn't matter if I lose. I just want to feel like someone's in my camp.
Yeah, I just want to feel like I got the real answer.
Where do you find your business, or how does that come to be? Like, how does that conversation start?
It actually, it started initially, like I said, with some people that I'd already worked with. When I was arbitration director, they were calling me and asking me questions. I did tell them hey, I'm going to start this business if you know anybody. So initially it was word of mouth. And then I'm a member of this group online called Real Success of the Car Biz, which cracks me up. I love it's a Facebook group. Pretty fantastic. Shout out to the team there. They crack me up. And I actually got a couple of customers from there, because a lot of people would post arbitration questions and I would hop on and answer. And then they'd give me a call or DM me and say, hey, can you help me with this? And so ultimately it's a lot of word of mouth. It's a lot of individuals who know me and have worked with me, recommending me to their friends. And as I'm growing, the plan is to eventually be, a nationwide tour de force. But for right now, I'm pretty localized to California. I have done work with a dealer in Alabama and a dealer in Florida, though, so I can say that I am nationwide.
Of course, you're in California. This is where all the problems start,
Yes.
all of them in California. So
I always say geographically the best state in the nation. Otherwise, that's a personal preference.
Yeah. No, listen, the weather, you're close to everything, snow, water.
Surfing, everything.
I did a podcast where I was like, listen, there's a couple of things that are guaranteed in life, right? We know death and taxes is one. And if you're in California, it's death, taxes, more taxes, gas taxes. And then I said, of course, your name, but it was licensing. I've never seen so many versions of taxes. Yeah. And then I was just out in Houston, and sure enough, it really just hit close to home, because you go see gas down in Houston and it's like $2.40 a gallon.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I haven't seen $2.40 a gallon in California since 1994.
It is so interesting too, because the geography of the state makes it really difficult for the state to manage air quality, right? Like in New York, the wind is going to be blowing offshore onto the ocean, taking all of that smog and stuff that happens in the industry up there, takes it out to the Atlantic Ocean and away from the cities. In LA, we have the wind blowing the other direction, pushing the smog back up. And because of the San Bernardino Mountains and that whole range, it just holds it there. So California did have to get really strict on air quality, and that includes gas. The part of the reason they have those taxes is because they're trying to limit people using it, because it damages our air quality so much, and we live in like a fishbowl where the air just sits. And so, that is something that is a unique challenge of living in California. And it is funny because it's because of the geography of California that we're in that position.
Yeah, because we get the wind blowing through rather than blowing away, and
right. And so
it does change things on what they're using that money. Well, what they say they're using the money for. That's perhaps
the scope of this conversation
for a different time.
They're actually doing.
Yeah, so I don't know if that's where the money's going, but that's what they say the money's for.
That's what they say, right?
Now, understanding that, as the business changes and we're seeing the highest used car compression we've ever seen. I mean, what you're buying cars for now is never been higher, to include COVID, because at least when you bought them in COVID, the sales side of it was equal as high. So you were able to, obviously, you had still had that spread, but seeing compression and lane fees and transport going up because of obviously gas, the level of confidence in the people that you have, because let's get real, not all transport companies are the same, is Where do you see the market going? Because as compression shrinks, or as it's get like our compressions are so thin, how does a dealer now operate in this used car world based on what you're seeing? Where do they find the inventory? How do they do it in a methodical way? Or what is like an idea that you've thought of that maybe like people aren't thinking of? Something that's like we have to do something different. We can't continue this and think we're going to be successful.
Yeah, well, I think that this is creating a perfect opportunity for people like yourself who are going to be helping with setting up these buying centers, looking at private party buying. But one of the things that I think is going to be really critical is really having, and it's again kind of leading in like similar to your business, but really having a really robust plan for how to not only find the cars, but how to make sure that they're the quality that you expect. And that's where a lot of I see people who are essentially paying for like contract buyers to go out and inspect cars for them. And maybe they don't do the bids, but they at least look at it, see if it has frames, see if the navigation's working and that kind of thing. Because those are the things that really nickel and dime you. And when you're talking about, margin compression, you really don't have a lot of leeway to fix some silly things that can go wrong on cars that you cannot arbitrate for. Knobs are missing, the sunroof is not quite where it needs to be, whatever the case is. These are going to be things that won't be arbitrable, but they will cost you money. And so part of the strategy, I think, is going to be really making sure that the auctions you're buying from are very transparent about the way that the cars are, the way they're coming in, the condition they're in. And then also, as much as you can, get a human being to look at it. As much as that's like, it's kind of contrary because everybody's going digital, but it's like, ultimately, there really isn't any way to be 100% confident in the condition of a car, a used car, I should say, without actually seeing it in person. And so a lot of auctions are really investing a lot in their inspection software. I think that's great. I think, Open Lane has their guaranteed as inspected, and their inspections include mechanical inspections. Mannheim is doing a lot of work with their CR teams and making sure that the images are as advanced as they can be. They have underbody imaging and stuff like that. So really the auctions are working on creating more transparency. And as a buyer, I think it would be important to stick with the auctions that are really focusing on that and avoiding any auctions that are maybe not as transparent in the beginning.
Now, it's funny you say like looking at the car because, guys, we normally talk about all kinds of technology and all kinds of innovation and all kinds of getting better. Mm-hmm. What Marissa just said is we're going back to the 80s, folks, the 70s and 80s, and we're going to go to the auction and we're going to do this crazy new thing called touch a car. We're going to touch it, feel it, drive it.
So we only have two options, right? If you're buying digitally, you have to trust the inspection. To a certain extent, you have no other choice. If you're trusting the inspection, you get the car and it isn't as inspected, then if you're going to continue buying digitally, you have to plan for the stupid knickknacks and things in cars that break that you're going to have to replace, which means that you're not going to have as much money to put on the car because you have to assume there's going to be some recon, right? And then the other option, if you're going to keep buying digitally, is just face the loss, right? So ultimately, working within Mannheim and working at CarMax, where we were representing cars as well as we could to the people who are going to be buying, really there even with all of this technology investment, cars are so unique that it's really, really difficult to present them in a way that all of the relevant pieces are going to be there for a buyer to see. Sure. It's really difficult as an auction to determine what is going to be important to a buyer because different buyers have different things that matter to them. So I think what's important is the auctions are going to continue investing in. They've said it out loud. They've, shown it on their books. They're making investments in the technology. They're making sure their inspections are going to show up in the way that they make sense to. But at the end of the day, you either have to back up and assume that you're going to have to pay a little bit more on that car than you want because margins are compressing. You don't have a lot of leeway, or you need to have somebody go look at the car. Another thing is that there's ways to look at condition reports to make sure that you're hitting some points that are frequently missed. At auction, there are things that you can see that auctions are really good at representing and making sure are there. And then there are things that they're maybe not as great at. And that's an area where, again, training your people and making sure that they're as effective as they can be, that they're savvy buyers, that they know the product that they're working with. That's another one. A lot of arbitrations that I had to deal with were often things that were inherent to the car. It was just something like, this is going to happen. You bought a Nissan. What are you expecting? And that type of thing is something that as a buyer, that's literally your whole job. is to know what inventory you need, how to buy it, and how to get the best that you can out of it. So I'm not saying that we should never buy digitally. What I am saying is that really the only way to know for sure if this car fits what you're looking for is to see it yourself. And if you're not able to do that, then you're going to be going through all of these different, this technology to try to replicate that same experience. And there's stuff.
I think it's great that you're saying that, like, because I would never say don't buy digitally either, right? Digital is a pathway there. But what I love that you hit is a couple of things, and we'll use this to kind of like get into this for you guys is, so if we go look at the car, you test drive it, you see the knobs, the little things, because that's where it gets you. All those little things, a fan grate, a knob, the nav screen is blinking. So it might have worked in the CR, but it's blinking. So it's intermittent, things of that nature. Now it gets back to you and you're like, man, I thought this was $2,500, $3,000 worth of safety. Now it's $6,000. Yeah. So what I think is interesting is, so like what I do for those of you guys, if this is your first time ever watching, is that I build some of the largest buying centers in the country and focus on both your service drive, your trade process, and private party acquisition. Now, the real reason I did that and really honed in there is I had a real just problem with the auctions because I would buy cars and it was kind of like a 50-50. It was a coin flip of the 50% of the times I got, I was like, man, this car is exactly how it was repped. And then 50% of the time it was an absolute hot mess and I was turning around trying to get off of it and send it back to the auction or reselling it.
Right.
And so I was like, there had to be a better way. And so by having cars come in and working your service drive and your trade process effectively in buying centers, if I touch it, I drive it, I feel it, you should, and I'm not going to sit there and say you do, but you should have your safety down to pennies on the dollar because you know everything if you did this effectively. If you're going digitally, yes, you're going to have to assess anywhere between $500 to $3,000 of applicable things that could happen on any given car, depending on what it is. Like if you buy, like, let's say a Nissan Leaf, okay, well, how many miles are on that battery? Because this thing could get real interesting real quick.
Yeah.
Or if you bought like a 2015 Range Rover with 80,000 miles, there's some things that just are going to be wrong with that car because of what it is.
Yeah.
And if you would have seen that car, touched that car, not saying you would have caught everything, but if you drove it, you probably would have caught some things. Right. So what I think is interesting about that is we're getting back to using technology with the undercarriage things and the pictures being better and everything else, but you still have to assess some little things because they're not going to mark every single thing wrong with this car. Because the moment you do that, now you make it look like it's a problem, even though it might be little minor things, right?
Right. And even if they do mark everything, they're used cars. They break. Sometimes you mentioned Land Rovers. Like Land Rovers can come in and they look clean as a whistle, but after a week at the auction, they're leaking. Yep. And so they first do the inspection. Of course, there's going to say there's no oil leaks because there aren't.
There wasn't.
But now it's been a couple weeks, and you can see that puddle of oil and no one's surprised.
And so when I look at that is like, do you want to really be able to take control? So like if you hired like a professional buyer or an assessor and they go look at it because you're trying to save off issues. That's smart. That's really effective. However, there's a cost to it, right? So we always talk to dealers and they're always like, oh, it's too expensive. Oh, I can't afford that. You can't afford not to anymore. You like having a buying center and a private party acquisition strategy you have to have. If you're going to go to the auction, you do need to think about one of two things. Either have someone there, which means you're paying for flights or having people there, or you need to factor in, you can't just throw into the V Autos or the Max Digitals or whatever else like, oh, $2,500 for safety. That's just a round number. No, you need to factor in. That's probably going to be double that now because there are things that just get inherently missed. And then when you think about that is if you buy cars like that, don't be surprised when you're like, well, I own this car for too much. Well, had you put your hands on it, you gave yourself the ability to say no. By not having your hands on it, listen, it's like, lipstick on a pig, right? Like it's one of those things where if it looks really good, the Range Rover, it looked good. The CR is great. Then it gets there and all of a sudden I put it on the rack and the thing starts puking liquids at me. You're like, oh my God, now I need $4,000 worth, which isn't arbitratable because it wasn't in there. This happens on that particular brand. It is pretty standard to expect a leak or 2 or 5. And so now you're like, okay, I have to deal with this. So we have to start being, I think, smarter in the sense of, are we looking for excuses or are we mapping out how to be effective? Right. And
I really like that.
Control of your own business and stop trying to blame other people because you didn't, like, we think we have to invest more. No, you just have to have people, maybe they make less, or maybe it's more of a focus, but it's guys, we need to be more effective so that if something happens, it's the exception, not the rule. Because right now we're looking for everyone to blame rather than taking control of our own business.
Right. And I think that's part of it. As somebody who was, sitting in the hot seat for arbitration, some of the conversations that I had were a little bit like, hey man, like all of this stuff could have been avoided if you treated yourself as a professional in this industry. Like if you, worked on your knowledge base, you understood your products a little bit better. Like these are all things that this training can help you be a more effective buyer and not end up, with your pants around your ankles later on because you didn't check these things. And so I don't think it's going to be feasible or practical for us to go back to fully, in-person buying only. I think that the digital buying, I guess, renaissance or whatever you want to call it is something that is here to stay. I think we're going to keep buying digitally. But between dealers, buyers, sellers, and the auctions, I think we're really going to have to work out, what is important to us? What are the things that we really, really need to know about the cars? And what are the things that we maybe can have, that we can figure that out later? Because really right now, I feel like the auctions are kind of walking this tightrope between sellers. As you noted, if you bring up everything that's on a car, every used car is going to look like a piece of trash.
Yep.
So, because it's a used car, as we like to say in sales, like they have seen the road, so you're going to see some marks of the road. But with, but at the same time, buyers are over here like, hey man, I'm trusting this. And as you noted, something that seems like it could be a minor issue could be something very, very expensive to fix. So there's a lot of attention on it. There's a lot of investment in it. And I think that as buyers and sellers, the best way that we can protect ourselves is, again, make sure that we have these relationships and I guess include the human layer over the technology. Don't forget about the human part of what we're doing. The technology is awesome. It's great. It's here to stay. We need to adapt to it. But part of adapting to it, I think, is learning how to use our teams in a hybrid way. So we're relying on technology partly, and then we're also relying on these, human beings that we know can assess the situation and pull all this information together and make a good decision.
No, I 100% agree because technology is not going away. I love it. I love technology when you encompass it. I think it's more of you need to have a holistic strategy, right? Take control what you can, right, in your in-store operations and think about that. If you're going to go digitally, understand. And I think part of the understanding too is I had Frank Knox on my podcast. Actually, I think that one just published. And it was simply this, is you got to be strategic and surgical about what you're doing is and I know this is going to come off as weird to people, but you don't get to make money in all three sectors of the auto dealership on every car. Now, I get it. In COVID, you got lazy and you got fat and you got happy because you're like, man, I made money in fixed ops, front end, back end. Man, I was like a pig in shit. This was fantastic. Yeah, that's not real anymore, okay? So you get to pick one or two of those areas you focus your profitability on. And if you're buying from the auction, they kind of took care of it for you. It won't be in front end. So now you get to make it in the fixed ops and possibly the back end if you have a good finance department. Yeah. But 2 out of 3 isn't bad. But then if you have that holistic strategy, whether it be a buying center, a really strategic trade-in process, service drive, well, then you can control those ones. So those where maybe you make your front end and your back end and maybe not as much in fixed ops. But then on the auction, you focus on fixed ops. So it's got to be one of these things that people get better. They have to learn how to transform or adjust to what the market is presenting right now. And what I think we can wrap up on is that, one, you have a slew of skills that I don't think are being utilized by enough people. So guys, you got to give Marissa a call. I got to spend time with her at Used Car Week. And I promise if you guys think that I'm even halfway smart, this girl makes me look like I'm the dumbest person in the world. So he is a walking genius. Okay. However, is that we need to focus on a couple things this year. First one is we need to focus on communication and relationships, right? Because that's how we build stuff together, because that's what we're made for. But 2, training can't be an expense anymore. It has to be an investment, because I think the person I had on my podcast, and we talked about we may have burned out some people. How many times are we going to keep staying on this wheel of burning people out and firing people and the turnover in the auto industry? Because that's ridiculous. Yeah. Why don't we invest in them and train them and get them to where we need them to be for us, and understand that they're not going to be there in a month, 2 months, or 6 months. It might take, I know this is going to sound crazy to the dealerships because this means you'd have to invest 12 months to train someone properly, a whole 12. Okay.
Well, if you think about it, and again, part of my job with Run Buggy and with Nickels is talking to dealers. And the ones that I see are really successful are the ones that identify people who are enthusiastic and intelligent and who want to do it, and then really investing in mentoring and training them. And then they're able to not it's like they cloned themselves right now. Now I have another version of me who's going to be as effective because I invested that time, because I took, what I knew and I imparted it to this other person. And I think dealerships where the leadership team maybe doesn't focus in that way, they tend to have a different culture, and they tend to be, I like to think of it as like they tend to be a little bit more temporary stop points on a larger career path.
Sure. And I think that could easily be said too, in a different way is, listen, if I clone me, which we don't want that to happen. I mean, one of me is enough, but like assuming that we were able to clone a me, like, am I not selfishly making my job a lot easier? Right? It's the working smarter, not harder. And for the people that don't, and let's say they micromanage, or they're more of dictators, or that like Stalin type tactic of like, do what I say, not as I do, doesn't that create that level of stress of like, you're never satisfied because no one ever lives up to the hype? No. Well, it's because, and I'm not saying that I'm replicatable or not replicatable. It's very hard to make somebody that has work ethic and drive and intelligence. Right. That is very hard to find. But are you even making any attempt at honing that and training that, or are you just giving up because they didn't do it fast enough to make you happy? Not everybody learns at the same band speed or can do things. Yeah. And so I look at that and go like, look, when you have people like you that you can put on your team and surround yourself with winners, right? People that win, that people that work, right? Yes, there's that exception to the rule that people that don't work that hard, but there's your geniuses and get it done. Great. Good luck finding one of those. People who win are people who work. And you've got to give them that ability to work. So you've got to prepare them. You've got to get them ready. And you've got to invest in them. And more importantly, don't be afraid if you invest in someone, they're going to leave. Because in essence, that's like a testament to you that you put someone out there and they're going to talk about. I've never heard anyone that's been invested in talk shit about the people that invested in them. They're always saying like, this is where I got my start. This is who helped me get there. They don't say, oh yeah, these jacks over here. No. And so if we
but then like, so now you as a person, right, on a personal level, there's a certain amount of satisfaction in treating somebody and helping change their life. But then on a professional level, if you get a reputation as being somebody who can train rock stars, how easy is it going to be for you to find rock stars?
and to recruit when you think about that, if like, hey, this person got a job and they talked about this person got a job and went to this, and you start seeing that, how many people are going to want to come work for you?
Yeah.
Right. How many people are going to want to kind of be there? So like one of the young ladies I had at Used Car Week on my podcast, like, I don't know how they deal with their training, but what I do know about that organization is those people don't leave. Like they've got like handfuls of 25 and 30-year employees. And when you look at that, I don't know if they do training, but I can tell you right now, their culture, man, is about investing in people. Now, it might not be about investing in continued education, but it's about investing in their people, keeping them there, which either side of that is, man, who doesn't want to work for somewhere where you don't have to worry about your job every month? Right. Like that's a recruiting tool in itself. So I just think it's one of those things when we look at this, we have to reshape our mind or reprogram our mind of training is the way to get better or continued education. And for your store, I'm not saying you have to go and have train someone for someone else's agenda. Get them the knowledge and then tell them or show them what you need for your store to be successful, right? So they can grow with you. But I absolutely love the fact that you look at like that and that you want to like you want to be on both sides of it in the sense of, hey guys, I'm here to help you, but it's like, I'm going to provide you the best answer possible, right? I'm not angling either way. And just the fact that like how you handle yourself and how you go about that is it's really about how you get better, right? And how you have those communications and those relationships, because that's in essence, that's where it starts.
One of the clients that I started with, I worked with them on how they approached arbitration, and it got to a point where they don't need me anymore. And that's honestly, I'm happy with it.
That's the best situation that could possibly happen, is that you got them to a point where they feel good enough they can handle it on their own. That is a true coach, a leader, mentor, whatever version that people need to say. Because if I build you a buying center, yes, I would love you to do a 10-year contract and we're just partners forever. That is not my goal. I want to build it for you to where you can do it without me so I can go do another project. I'm not trying to be there forever. Not that I would say no, but that is not what I go into it with. So,
Right.
well, I want to thank you, Marissa, for being here. I want to thank you for coming on, kind of giving us some insights, because that's what we want to do on Street Smarts is, one, we take it to the streets. We don't want to hear talking points and everything else. We want to give people insights so that when they're done, we're hoping that you guys are listening, commenting, sharing, but more importantly, that you learned one thing today, which I know I did, because there's some things that Marissa had some experience with that I probably would have lit all the arbitration people on fire. But now it's just making me think there might be some good ones out there, and that there's different ways to look at this, and that you really need to have that relationship. So I want to thank you for coming on. I hope you have massive success with what you're doing. I'm sure that our paths will cross here shortly. I mean, at least in January at NADA.
Yeah.
So anything that you have or that you want to throw out there as final thoughts?
Yeah, I think honestly, I'm excited to see where this industry is going. I'm excited to see how technology is really leveling us all up. And I'm happy to be a part of that in any small way.
All right, guys. Well, you guys, here's another edition of Street Smarts where we took it to the streets. We'll see you guys next week with another episode. And Marissa, hang out for just a second.